Hello. Um, Welcome to the program here this afternoon. My name is Ben Clark. I'm the archivist, and I'm going to be moderating the talk here today. I'm just going to let you know ahead of time. We're going to leave this sort of lobby open, I guess. We're gonna actually get started in a couple minutes. If you're joining us after the fact and you're watching the video, not live, and you can always skip ahead a couple minutes. We're going to start about 4 or 5 minutes. So you can just skip the video ahead, or get up and come back in 5 minutes. Get some some tea or something like that, some coffee to get ready for a great talk. But for those of you who are joining us live, welcome. Hope you're having a wonderful weekend. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to keep talking just to make sure that while I check the audio here. I think it's usually fine, but it always pays to double check just in case. Okay, yeah, looks like that's working there, and let me get the other one, because we're doing this both on Facebook and YouTube Live. If you're ever wanting to watch, it's always one of those two places, or both. But that means I have to check 2 streams here, but should be fine if it's working on one. Again, I'm just talking just to make sure that the audio is working. Cool. Great. Well, while I have your attention here as we get ready to get started, I want to take a moment. We'll just get some of the business out of the way ahead of time here. Actually, the very first thing is it's a good thing. This is our first public announcement of our next History Speaks. Today, we're talking about the Civil War and the role and how that affected women. But next week, or next month, I should say, we have the opportunity to, well, sorry, we'll do this. Here we go. Brent Zinkel, who some of you may know as a history teacher here in Wausau at the high school level, he is actually going to be doing a presentation about the Spanish flu, the 1918's influenza pandemic, and kind of look at specifically how Wausau reacted. We're sort of an outlier within an outlier, as the title is. So he's going to look at both the reaction to it and sort of how it fared going forward. And that'll be, again, very timely, I think, for the times, but also in itself a great presentation. So again, if you're interested in tuning, we'll put more stuff out there too, in the newsletter and everything, but that's going to be at, again, 2 p.m. on a Saturday, but that's going to be on May 22nd. So yeah, if you're interested in that, make sure to come back for that. And while we're talking about this, yeah, again, thanks to Yankee Bookstore. They're our sponsor this year for the History Speaks program. So big thanks to them and all of our members, of course, who keep us going here at the museum and the Historical Society. If you're happen to be joining us and you're not already a member, and you're looking for a way to support some local history and these sort of programs, that'd be a great opportunity. You can always visit our website, marathoncountyhistory.org, or give us a call or whatever, and we will put you in touch if you're interested in becoming a member. A lot of benefits. You get our newsletter and all sorts of stuff. So and you get the benefit of supporting local history. So yeah. Let's see how we're doing. Okay, we're about 2 minutes. All right. Just on the format here, obviously we are streaming this, so we can't take live interactions. But if at any point you have any questions, comments, suggestions, critiques, whatever, and you just want to say hello, feel free to put that in the chat or the comment section. We will have some time at the end after Brett's finished with his prepared stuff to talk about some questions, and so. Encourage you to do that. I'll remind you again at the end in case you're so caught up and you can't think in the moment. But that's so just let you know that is a thing. But yeah, no need to silence in your devices or anything like that. You're in your own home. So yeah, I think that covers the business here. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to invite Brett here to join the call. Yeah. My pleasure to introduce to you Professor Brett Barker, who's going to be doing our presentation here. So there you go.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I am Brett Barker. I'm professor of history at UW-Stevens Point at Wausau and down at UW-Stevens Point as well. And I want to thank you all for coming today, joining us virtually. And today I want to talk about women and the Civil War. And, when I was thinking about this topic, I think in some ways it's a deceptively simple topic. And I want us to think about that for a minute. And I want to share some ways other people have used that term in the past. One thing that often comes to mind that seems to get a lot of people's attention is the idea that they pay a lot of attention to the fact that a very few women uh, disguised themselves as men and joined both armies. Our best estimate is that something like 300 to 500 women managed to join the Union Army and serve as soldiers. And that gets a lot of play. One recent book on women in the Civil War actually devotes a third of the book to that topic. And I want to sort of suggest that that may not be the most useful way to think about the topic. After all, even at 500 out of 2 million Union soldiers, that would be 1/250th of 1% of the Union Army. So if that's what women's contribution to the war effort or women's participation or even women's experience in the war effort was about, then that wouldn't be very significant. But I don't think that's really what's going on. In some ways, that you can see that as sort of the Queen Elizabeth view of history. Oh, it's a woman who's doing what men traditionally did, and therefore we pay attention to her. I think that really is selling women's contribution and women's experience in the Civil War quite short. Something much more significant is going on, and something I think that is often overlooked and ignored. I'm reminded of a collection of papers down at the Wisconsin Historical Society that I looked at when I was doing research as a graduate student. And it was a family's papers from the Civil War era. It was all the collection of all their letters and their correspondence into one archive box. And I opened it up to see how things were organized. And I thought, well, it'll probably be chronological. And indeed it was. But what it said was there were folders, and it said Civil War Correspondence 1861. Then the next folder was called Non-Civil War Correspondence 1861, and Civil War Correspondence 1862, Non-Civil War Correspondence 1862, and so on. I thought, well, that's curious. I wonder how they've decided what that means. And when I looked into the folders, and these folders had been labeled to the Wisconsin Historical Society's defense probably early in the 20th century, if not earlier, I found that the Civil War correspondence was the correspondence from soldiers in the family writing home, and the non-Civil War correspondence was letters, many of them, of course, from women, from the home front to the battlefront. And that's a curious way of looking at the Civil War. And I understand that when most people think of the Civil War, what do they think of? They think of Grant and Lee and Gettysburg and Lincoln, and I understand that those stories are all compelling. They're everywhere. They're in fact what drew me originally to the Civil War. Indeed, and maybe unfortunately, when people do think about women in the Civil War, one of the first people who comes to mind is often Mary Todd Lincoln. I want to say a little bit more about her at the end. But what I really want to do today is to think about if 1/250th of 1% of the Union Army was comprised of females disguising themselves as men. What were the other 99.975% of women during the Civil War doing? And I'll be honest, because of time and because I think this is a very rich story, I'm going to limit today to talk about the women that I know the most about. And so I'm going to talk about Northern women. I'm not going to talk for the most part about Southern women. Largely not going to talk about slave and free Black women in the South. Those are compelling, important stories. They are also stories, I think, that while they might be seldom told, they might be told a little less seldom than the story I want to tell today. And that, again, is about Northern women during the Civil War. So first of all, let's think about what they were actually doing. Many of their activities that were new and useful and unusual, perhaps from previous experience were things that were often seen as a natural outgrowth of what society at the time said was a traditional female role. And I want to talk about those first. And one of the most significant, perhaps, excuse me while I try to manage the technology here for a minute, one of the most significant, in fact, was the role of nurses. And so Clara Barton is probably the best known Northern nurse during the Civil War. She is rightly famous as later founder of the American Red Cross. She got her start realizing the need for medical supplies on Civil War battlefields. She also played a pivotal role in identifying the dead after battles, the dead at Andersonville after the war, too, the most notorious Confederate prison camp for Union soldiers. And so she played critical roles, and I think many people have heard of Clara Barton and know her role as nurse. And she's someone who I think is pretty well known, but talks about that role as a nurse. Another one who also served in a similar role, but one who actually, no offense to Clara Barton, she's famous, she's wonderful, but I personally am much more taken by Mary Ann Bickerdike, who was always almost usually called by the soldiers Mother Bickerdike. She was a Quaker widow. She became a tireless advocate for wounded soldiers during the war. She helped found or run over 300 hospitals on 20. She was present near 20 different battlefields. And what she became famous for was cutting through red tape. She was the person who said, I don't want to hear about excuses. I don't want to hear about bureaucracy. I don't want to hear about how the military runs. I want to get supplies to the soldiers. I want to take care of the Union wounded. They deserve our care. And in fact, the Confederate wounded too, in many cases. She said, I want to take care of these men, and I will not hear that it can't be done. I will only want to hear how it's going to be done. In one of the most famous cases, she desperately needed to get some supplies to a Union hospital. She did not have the transportation necessary. Generally, General Grant and General Sherman, she was serving the Western Theater, Generals Grant and Sherman were fans of her, as they often tried to do everything they could, but logistics during the Civil War often was quite a problem. And so in this case, she needed to get some supplies to the front. And without adequate transportation, she saw that a general had his own small business, his own little train, sort of an engine with a couple of cars attached to it that he had for his own transportation. And she more or less commandeered it, took it over, loaded it with supplies, and sent it off to the battlefield. And this irate general complained to William Tecumseh Sherman. And it's funny to think about, Sherman has this reputation. He's the guy who burned a 60-mile wide swath across Georgia, right? He burned on his march to the sea. He has this reputation as being this tireless fighter and pretty, war as hell, sort of a pretty hard reputation. And yet when this general complained to Sherman about what Mary Bickerdike had done, Sherman said, I'm absolutely powerless in this situation. I can do nothing. She ranks me. And by that, he meant she has such authority because she is morally scrupulous. She never does anything that is wrong. She is constantly and tirelessly working for the soldiers. And the officer corps knows it, and the men love her, and no one can get in the way of Mother Bickerdike and her work. And so you might as well not try. I mean, when she's done with your train, I'm sure she'll give it back, right? She truly became beloved by those Western armies. And to give you a sense of that and a sense of the honor that they felt towards what she had done to try to take care of sick and wounded men during the war. At the end of the war, the armies were invited to Washington, D.C. to parade. On the first day, the Eastern Union armies marched in victory in May of 1865. The next day, the Western soldiers marched. And the 15th Corps, one of the major elements of Sherman's army, asked Mother Bickerdike to march at their head as they marched down through Washington, D.C. in a parade at the end of the war. They asked this tireless, wonderful woman to do that for them. So there are these stories of heroism, of sacrifice, of nursing, of tirelessly work in the name of the war. And yet, those are two well known women. I want to take a moment and talk about a lesser known woman, but someone who I think can tell us a lot about what the experience was like for so many women. It is likely that at least a few thousand Northern women, and yes, many of them came from middle and upper class because they had to have the means to do this, went south to serve as volunteer nurses in the Union hospitals in Nashville, in Chattanooga, in Memphis, in the East, in Washington, D.C., certainly. Throughout all those places, served as volunteer nurses to help the wounded and the sick, much like more famously Clara Barton and Mother Bickerdike were doing. And one of them that I want to tell you something about is Emily Quiner. So at the beginning of the war, Emily Quiner was a 21-year-old single woman. She was living in her father's household in Madison, Wisconsin. Her father was Edwin B. Quiner, who would write one of the first histories of Wisconsin during the Civil War. And she decided to go south as a volunteer nurse, as so many other ordinary women did, in mid 1863. I don't, she had not, from what we know, her diary is what survives and where I'm taking all this from. In fact, here is a small excerpt from her diary I'm going to read you in a minute. From her diary, what I know is that she did not know firsthand other women who had done it before she did. So she did not have a lot of firsthand accounts of what it was like to be a nurse. But to her, it seemed to be good work. And I'm sure as a young woman, she saw a certain sense, adventure, romanticism. She would get away from her, father's household, express her independence. I think she saw the ways in which this experience could definitely benefit, as indeed it did. But I think she may have had a simplified romantic notion. She may have thought that what one did as a nurse is one went south and held soldiers' hands and helped them out and just sort of and was just beloved by everyone. And then she went to Memphis in 1863 and actually began to work in this Union hospital. And what she found was it was initially quite scary. At times it become quite depressing, but I think in the end it was ultimately exhilarating for Emily Quiner. So when she reached Memphis in July of 1863, this is one of her first entries in her diary after reaching Memphis. She wrote, "We found Mrs. Wemple, a Wisconsin lady, and Mrs. Green, a sort of under matron here. Very pleasant. They told us some very discouraging things, and for some time I felt rather blue over the prospect. So it turns out that nursing was going to be perhaps a little more serious and a little less romantic and lighthearted than Emily perhaps thought. 5 days later, she wrote this: One of my men is very sick. He cannot live. He is an Ohio boy. He is a very fine fellow, about 20 years old, just slightly younger than her. I would almost give the world if he could live. I wrote a letter to a cousin of his in the army at Vicksburg, telling him how he was and asking him to write home and inform his friends. He's very grateful for anything I do for him, and though he never says much, his eyes follow me everywhere. He's very homesick. How my heart aches when I think that this is the way that the flower of our country's youth are perishing in this cruel contest. I'm thankful that God has given me the opportunity to do some good, and pray that he will give me strength to do my duty faithfully in the fear of his holy name. Tired out tonight, went to bed with a heavy heart, almost expect to find Kent dead tomorrow morning." That was the name of the soldier. 2 days later, "Kent is very low tonight. I have sat by him all afternoon. He is very quiet. It seems as if I could not bear to see him die. The doctor will not let me tell him that he must die. There possibly may be a chance for his recovery, he says. I have no hopes of it. God pity his poor old mother, and God pity all the mothers whose hearts will ache through the terrible consequences of this unnatural war." And the next day, "Kent is dead. He breathed his last a half hour ago. I closed his eyes. They prepared him for the grave and took him away. I shall never forget the sorrow I felt for his death. He was so young, so patient, so lonely and homesick, and so grateful for everything I did for him. I shed as bitter tears over his dying bed as I ever wept in my life. It is so hard to see our noble boys die here alone, so far from friends who would give their lives almost to have been with them in their last moments. I shall write to his mother. The saddest duty of our position is this breaking of the tidings to anxious, loving hearts at home. God give you the strength to hear it, poor loving mother. My ward will seem lonely after this. I have watched him and fed and cared for him so long that the sight of his poor, pale face on the bed seemed a part of my life. Poor fellows, so they die. So the experience was trying, and yet I think in the end, ultimately rewarding. You can tell from those excerpts that in some ways she is really growing in her sense of herself, really facing an adult world that perhaps she'd been sheltered from in her comfortable Madison home, and facing the grim realities of both the war and of adulthood and life generally. She came back, by the account of people who she met, and she wrote in her diary, people say that I'm changed since I have come back from Memphis. She went back in August, back to Madison, and really seemed to have grown. She started her diary the day that Fort Sumter fell, because she said she went to the stationer and wanted to keep a diary because she wanted to record all the great events of the age. And she tirelessly kept her diary throughout 1861, 62, and 63, including her trip to Memphis. And when she came back, she continued to keep it. And then in August, she came back to Madison, as I said. In September, she and a friend had collected more supplies, and it was their intent to go back to Memphis and to continue working in the Union Hospital there. And at the very last moment, as she prepared to leave, her father, using the excuse that he needed her to help him write he was working on this early history of the war, that because he needed her to be a clerk, to write for him, to take care of things, he forbid her to go back to be a nurse. He would not let her return. So she had to tearfully tell friends that she was not allowed to go back to Memphis, that she'd be staying in Madison. She found someone to replace her, and she went home. She wrote a long entry about this in the diary, and then she wrote another long entry saying goodbye to her diary, and she stopped keeping her diary at that point. This is just my interpretation, but I think in some very real way, the Civil War ended for Emily Coiner right there. The Civil War had been an experience where it had allowed her growth. It allowed her new independence and new opportunities. And now that that had been shut off and she was going back into the life she had known before, she no longer felt that that life was worth recording on a day-to-day basis. As far as we know, she never kept a diary again. And so I think that that can show us through this one person's life, what the war must have meant for a lot of women, the way that things like being a volunteer nurse must have changed her life. So there was nursing. Nurses before the Civil War were largely male, almost exclusively male. Nursing after the Civil War began to take a decidedly female turn, which it remained for very much decidedly thereafter. And the Civil War was one of those turning points in that profession. And there was another one, teaching, particularly at the primary level. Before the Civil War, most teachers had been male, but with men going to the Civil War, many of those places had to be taken by women during the war. Some had before, certainly, but more now during the war were taken by women. Indeed, Emily served as a teacher in 1861 after the person who had taught the school previously went off to join the Union Army. She taught in a school just west of what was then west of Madison, would now be near what's Hilldale Mall, if you know Madison at all. She taught there during 1861. So she there had another horizon expanding experience as she sort of took on a new profession. She had attended a normal institute that allowed her to teach. And so she did that. They were both new opportunities for women. I should mention, by the way, that the first women ever admitted to the University of Wisconsin were admitted to a normal department, that is, that trained teachers, that opened up during the Civil War, partly because the university did not have enough male students to keep going. And so they begrudgingly admitted women to a normal department. And that was the beginning of women being educated at the University of Wisconsin. So it was also in some ways another hallmark of the war. So we see that some things are natural extensions of what women had been doing inside the home, sort of nursing and teaching, sort of being outgrowths now in the public. There are other ways that Northern women made a real difference in the war, not just as nurses and teachers, but in a couple of other ways I want to talk about. A third way was through supplies. The Union government was simply overwhelmed by what was necessary to form, clothe, and equip hundreds of thousands, eventually over 2 million soldiers. And so the Union government made many calls on women to please put together supplies that the Army so desperately needed. In April 1861, for instance, the governor called for lint and bandages, blankets and quilts, and asked women to do that. Women also, in many cases, sent supplies in boxes to men at the front, sometimes just generically, but often to earmarked for soldiers from their state or to a particular regiment, perhaps a company of which had been recruited in their hometown. And so these were ways in which often they sent these small things that made a difference in men's lives. It was all the Union government could do to keep men in a uniform and with a rifle and ammunition and the like, let alone these small things that would be sent along like jellies or other kind of baked goods, anything that they thought might, mittens, things that they thought might cheer up soldiers at the front. And when you think of these boxes, and they were almost always spoken of as boxes, I often think of something like we think of a care package, right? A small box that you send it. I'm not sure we should think of them that way. In fact, when Emily and a friend put together a box of goods to be sent to the soldiers at the front, her father, Edwin, had to engage, had to hire the largest wagon in Madison to get it down to the railroad depot. So this was no small little Amazon delivery. This was a huge crate, really, not a box. Emily did this, as many women did it, through local ladies' aid societies, which were formed in any town of any size throughout the North, where women cooperated and shared their efforts. Early in the war, they often sent these on through something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which coordinated a lot of these volunteer efforts and again sought to make sure that soldiers were properly cared for and made up for the small things that could be met through a sutler who was a salesperson who sort of followed a regiment, but also today might be, well, in a later generation would be made by the YMCA, or in a later generation, but modern way would be through the USO or perhaps through something like the PX. These things were made up by women's voluntary effort that they contributed to the war, and this made a real difference in the lives of the soldiers, and I would also argue the morale. A fourth way that women contributed to the Union war effort in a way that I think is often overlooked is in physical labor. Yes, all the things I've already mentioned required physical labor, but also in things like going into the fields. Something that's often underappreciated is the fact that at the beginning of the war, the South said that cotton was king. Well, it turned out that Europe needed northern wheat as much as it needed southern cotton. And certainly the Union armies needed food to survive. And in 1861, this wasn't a major problem. But in 1862, with more and more men going to the front, there was a real shortage of people to harvest, particularly of wheat, which has a very short range where it can be harvested when it's ripe before they open up and drop the grains to the ground. So it's a very labor intensive process, and there weren't enough men to do it. And so particularly in the harvest of 1863 and 64, women went to the fields, often on top of holding a family together, often on top of other duties. They also went into those fields to harvest the crops to make sure that they came in. And that, of course, was backbreaking labor of an entire different sort. Working in the home was backbreaking labor at the time to begin with, but then to go out into the fields and do that well while taking care of children, while running a household, all of these placed new demands, but I also argue offered new opportunities for women under the home front to keep the home front together, to help support the Union war effort in many important and significant ways. So in some ways, all of these can be seen as an extension of what was considered the traditional feminine role within within the family in Northern and American society at the time. But one thing we might ask is, did they also ascribe political meaning to their work? They could not participate formally in politics. They certainly couldn't vote. And so are women using this work in any way to express their political support for the war effort? I would say yes. And I would say that comes up in a lot of different ways. One of the most striking examples that I know of is what happened in 1861 at the beginning of the war in Madison. During the day, the state legislature, of course, composed of men at the time, put the state on a war footing, passed the bills necessary to raise an army, to pay for that army, to do everything necessary to send Wisconsin troops into the field. And then when they were done for the day, these large sewing machines were wheeled into the assembly chamber, and women from the town would come and spend most of the night sewing shirts for soldiers. And I've always told students, they could have sewn those shirts anywhere. Indeed, it might have been more practical to find a warehouse somewhere to put these machines in where they could go to and work during the day, during the night. I think that choosing to work at female work in the evenings in the same spot that men were doing the political support of the war during the day was a conscious political act by these women to say that this was them voting their support for the war effort. They sewed shirts at night in the same space that men passed bills and kept the state running during the day. I think another way we can see that women definitely thought that their contributions were a political statement and one that they expected to be respected is something curious that happens during the war. As I said earlier at the beginning, most of these voluntary efforts, most of the donations are going to something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission. The Sanitary Commission was largely populated by females, but run by men. And in the early part of the war, these men seemed not to really appreciate women's efforts. Instead of being appreciative of what women were sending, their circulars in response often had a somewhat, well, definitely had a paternalistic, but somewhat of a somewhat slightly disappointed tone that women weren't doing more. And you can imagine if you're one of these women who spends the whole night sewing shirts, who spends days putting together boxes, who goes off and serves as a voluntary nurse, that you want your efforts to be appreciated, not ridiculed, not criticized. And what we see is, as the war goes on, more and more of those locals ladies' aid societies begin giving their contributions to a rival group called the U.S. Christian Commission, which always was more appreciative of what they got. Now, perhaps at the beginning, that's because they're a rival and because they know that the U.S. Sanitary Commission is the largest commission and that they're competing for women's work and women's attention. But there seemed to be a different tone in the Christian Commission, and women transferred one could say their loyalty to an organization, today we'd think of as an NGO, an organization that appreciated their efforts more. There are other little signs. One thing that strikes me is when Emily was teaching school in 1861, she was simultaneously sewing a U.S. flag because she wanted the school to have a flag to fly. And when she was done, with the help of some of her students, they raised the flag. They sang the Star Spangled Banner. They actually had 2 flag raisings so that everybody could come. The first time they did just for the students, and then their parents came. I think that again is a political act in a way of her saying that she's supporting her country and supporting the Union war effort by doing that. Well, why does this all matter? First of all, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the Union war effort could not have continued materially without the work of women in the fields, in doing things like staffing hospitals, but also doing all the other things that I've chronicled here. But I also think that women supporting what the soldiers were doing was critical to Union morale. After all, let's face it, the most likely way that the war could have ended short of Union victory was simply if the South had won because the North gave up. The North decided not to continue to fight. The South doesn't have to conquer the North. The South merely has to stay alive long enough, intact long enough, that the North gives up the idea of trying to militarily conquer it and bring it back into the Union. It was a very tough 4-year job as it was. Could that have been sustained, particularly through the darkest days of late 1862 and early 1863, without the support of women on the Northern home front? I'm not at all convinced it could have been. And so I think that support is meaningful and significant in many ways, but let's just think about one, which would be desertion. During the Civil War, those soldiers did not have to cross an ocean to get home. They merely had to leave their regiment and find their way home. And in a time before Social Security numbers and fingerprints and let alone DNA or anything like that, biometrics, if a community was willing to harbor deserters who they think had justly abandoned the army and the war effort, it would have been impossible for the Union, through the provost marshal, to have rounded up deserters. Indeed, if they had found communities hostile to rounding up deserters, they would have been impossible even to hunt for them. And there are small places, particularly in the South, where that indeed happens. So I think without women's support for what men were doing on the front, I'm not certain at all that that military effort could have been sustained. So I want to think a little bit more about what the experience of war, I've talked about how women contributed to the war effort. I now want to think about what that experience was like for women and what it was like as an experience, not just of work and of contribution, but of daily life. So for some like Emily, the war offered new opportunities, but her diary reveals that she also recognized the painful nature of the Civil War in women's lives. For all Northern women, indeed for all Northerners, it was also an experience of loss, not just for those who traveled to hospitals near the front, like Emily, who experienced the death of the soldier Kent, but for many others. And I always bring it back to this because I think we cannot forget this about the Civil War. What the toll of the Civil War was. Our best estimate now is that the death toll of the Union during the Civil War was probably something closer to 435,000. Traditionally, 360,000 was used, but we now think that number was low. The Northern population in 1860 was 22 million. That is a death rate of 1.98%. As of early 2021, there were 328 million Americans. If 1.98% of us were to die in a 4-year war, that would be 6.5 million Americans. That's the rate at which Northerners were dying, and therefore Northern soldiers were dying, and therefore the rate at which Northerners were experiencing loss and the death of loved ones during the Civil War. So how do we measure that loss in human terms? Those numbers are almost overwhelming in some ways. Let me share a couple of small little anecdotes about the way in which those losses and that loss shows up in individual people's lives. First of all, in deprivation. When those men went off to war, often it was a burden for the families they left behind. I discovered something extraordinary when I was looking into the pension files of soldiers from the counties that I study in Wisconsin, Ohio. When I was at the National Archives, what I found was that you could actually get a pension during the Civil War if your loved one had died and you were dependent on them and they died in the war. You could get a pension even while the war was going on. Pensions became much more liberal later for survivors, but that's another story. But in during the war, you could get a pension. And to do so, you had to prove that you were dependent on the soldier that you had lost. And one of the greatest ways to do that, I found, was to send one of the soldiers' letters to the Bureau of Pensions, say to the War Department, saying, enclosed is a letter from my loved one now deceased, and in it he states that he is sending $10 to support the family from his last pay. And indeed, contained in the pension file is a letter from the now deceased soldier that he had sent home, and a clerk in the War Department has underlined the line in red pencil where the soldier said, I'm enclosing funds, and where he stated it. And that was seen as proof that you were dependent on the soldier. And that letter stayed in that soldier's pension file in Washington, D.C., remains there to this day. I found that something like 10% of the Union soldiers, the Union pensions that I found from the war contained an original letter from the deceased soldier proving his support for the family, whether that be a son or a husband, usually was the usual, a father, right? That was usual characteristics. Well, first of all, those letters are extraordinary because that they don't exist anywhere else. But I want us to think about that for a minute. These folks living in the northern home front needed that pension so badly to survive that they gave up what really was a holy relic, right? They gave up a letter from a dead loved one, writing home, which, by the way, also includes things like their love for their family, incidents of their life. You know, there's something very real and that you can capture in a handwritten letter from a soldier. And they're giving up this relic from a dead loved one because they need that pension so badly. Think about the emotional toll that death and now even the pension is taking on that family, on that husband, on that wife, on that daughter, on that mother, on that father. It's an extraordinary story of life, of loss. Not to say that you can't find a little humor, and those of you who've come to a lot of my presentations know that even in a dark moment like this, I can find a little bit of light point in the story. Even though there are stories like that, there's also the story of Wisconsin citizens who wrote to the state government because they felt that a fraud was occurring. So the dependents of Wisconsin soldiers were receiving a monthly allowance while the soldier was away, usually $10 a month, to support them while the soldier was away, because after all, they don't have the soldiers' earnings, right? There are letters in the file in Madison where people are writing that people are collecting that $10 fraudulently. Famously, in a letter I found from Reedsburg, a person wrote to the governor and said, you should take away this person's $10 a month because that couple, their son was not their son was not helping the family. Their son was a burden on the family. They're saving money by not having that deadbeat around. And then heartbreakingly saying, and by the way, there's another woman who lives down the road from them, and her husband is in the Army, and she's suffering, but she's too proud to take the $10 a month from the state. Is there some way you could take that $10 that couple's fraudulently collected and give it to the woman down the street and down the road instead, because she's really in need? So we do get these little glimpses of the way in which life in the Northern home front can be very tough. Another heartbreaking letter is one written by a woman who was clearly probably German was her native language, and she's writing to the governor about all the correspondence to the governor during the wars is saved and collected down in the state archives, and she's writing to the governor, and she says, you know, my husband joined up into the regiment, actually a German regiment, and I haven't heard from him since he went off to war. And I wrote to one of his friends in the Army, and they said that he fallen off them cars, and they haven't seen him since. She means he's fell off the cars, meaning he fell off the train they were taking to the front. Indeed, the roster shows that he had fallen off the train and was supposed dead. She had never received any notice of that. During the Civil War, there was no regular way of notifying loved ones of the death of a soldier. Often the captain wrote a letter, someone else tried to write a letter, a friend tried to write a letter, but there wasn't often a formal way of notifying, certainly not in good time. It's nothing like a graves and registration service. And so oftentimes you'd get a letter later from a friend in the regiment or from a colonel. Sadly, sometimes you would receive the news through a telegraphic report. There'd be a list of casualties from the telegraph office posted. It would then appear in the paper, and there would be a list of the wounded and dead, and your loved one might be there. So I think, again, when trying to imagine part of the emotional toll of the war on women, it's that you are sitting at home waiting for such dreadful news and not being able to always be even certain of that news. Some of those reports were wrong, to be frank. Think of that, what that was like. No wonder so many of those women turned to try to do some good work. So we get little glimpses of ordinary people's lives, but yes, to go back to where we started, the best documented cases are amongst the elite powerful. A story that you might know of, and if you don't, I think you should, is of Cordelia and Lewis Harvey. Lewis Harvey was elected governor in the fall of 1861 of Wisconsin. Became governor, was inaugurated in early 1862. In April of 1862, he'd heard the bloody Battle of Shiloh had occurred in Tennessee. He heard that the Union was completely unprepared for the medical needs that would occur at the end of that battle. So he brought together medical supplies and a few nurses and doctors and led a relief expedition to Tennessee. And while he was there, as the sitting governor of Wisconsin, while he was there, he died. And news of his death reached Madison, and Emily Quiner reported it in her diary on April 21st, 1862. And I'm going to read it to you because you probably can't read that, right? This is Emily Quiner writing about the death of Lewis Harvey. We all felt a shock of deep sorrow this morning when news came through that Governor Harvey had been drowned in the Tennessee River as he was going from one boat to another. His loss was a terrible blow to his wife. She was on the street when the report came, getting subscriptions for the relief of a poor family in town. She inquired why the Capitol and courthouse flags were at half-mast, and they would not tell her. She then told them to tell her if he was dead, and reading it on their faces, dropped senseless to the ground. As soon as she was sufficiently composed, she took the cars for Chicago, where friends reside. News had reached the telegraph office. The telegraph office was closer to the state capitol than she was. Friends went scrambling around the streets to find Cordelia. They did not find her before the flags were lowered to half-mast. And then when she saw her friends running towards her, she knew what the purpose of that half-mast must be, asked them if they were dead, and fainted when she could tell in her eyes. Yes, she was the first lady of Wisconsin, but she suffered loss in a way that was all too painfully reminiscent for so many Wisconsinites. I think Cordelia, though, is an inspiring story despite her loss. There she is in mourning cloaks on the left, really a haunting photograph. She went on to be a state military agent for Wisconsin. She cared for soldiers, got information about them back to their families, looked after, recorded some graves of Wisconsin soldiers who died on the battlefield, so their families knew where they were, did many other kindnesses and useful tasks for the state. She also had a lot to do with getting hospitals set up throughout Wisconsin, where soldiers, she met with Abraham Lincoln and convinced him to open hospitals in Wisconsin so soldiers could be closer to home to recover. And after the war, she served as the superintendent of the Soldiers' Orphans Home, pictured on the right, which was open for 10 years after the war for the orphans of Wisconsin soldiers. And so she turned her own personal tragedy into turning it to help other people who had suffered loss like she did. So finally, I'd like to come back to where I started, Mary Todd Lincoln. And I want us to think about loss and about grief and about all Northern women. And I want us to think about Mary Todd Lincoln again. And some of you know what I think about Mary Todd Lincoln. But if you've not heard it, here it goes. She is the best known and least understood of all Northern women during the war. Adopted Northern woman, right? She was called by Billy Herndon, who was Lincoln's law partner, and by Nicolay and Hay, who were his secretaries in the White House during the war, the Hellcat. She had a reputation for being difficult. She deserved a lot of that reputation. But I want to think about why for a minute and think about loss for Northern women during the Civil War. Mary Lincoln's life, her adult life, had been a story of loss. She had lost little Eddie Lincoln, her son, in 1850. It had taken her a long time to get over that, but she had by the beginning of the war. So when they came to Washington in 1861, the war, Lincoln was inaugurated in March. The war began in April. In May of 1861, a family friend, a man named Elmer Ellsworth, who, by the way, Ellsworth, Wisconsin is named after, was killed in Alexandria, Virginia in May of 1861, one of the first Union officers to die in the war. He was taking a Confederate flag down from something called the Marshall House in Alexandria. The owner of the Marshall House shot him dead as he came down the steps with the flag. He was a friend of the Lincolns. He lay in state, and she mourned his loss. He became the first of many that she would mourn. And it gets worse. In October of that same year, another family friend, Edward Baker, was killed at a small battle called Ball's Bluff. He had been a family friend. It was a terrible loss to the family on its own. But there's even more tragedy encoded there, because what Mary knew, everyone knew, the Lincolns knew, but people now often forget, is that little Eddie she had lost in 1850 had been named after Edward Baker. It dredged up the loss of one of her sons from 10 years earlier and only reinvigorated that grief, I think. That's October of 1861. 4 months later, another son, William Wallace, died probably of typhoid fever in the White House, February 1862. She was inconsolable. Lincoln worried that she was losing her mind. He desperately worried about her and her sanity. She became more brittle. She began to spend well beyond their means. She tried everything she could. She became more difficult to deal with. But remember the losses that had piled up. She did have little Tad, but that was not enough comfort for her. She suffered for the rest of the war, and she was hard to get along with. And remember that at the end of the war, she was holding Abraham Lincoln's hand when John Wilkes Booth fired a derringer into the back of his head and assassinated him. And once again, a man that she loved had left her. 6 years later, little Tad died at the age of 18. Really is real comfort to his mother, leaving only one child alive, Robert Todd Lincoln. Robert Todd had been the eldest. Lincoln was the eldest Lincoln boy. He grew increasingly either frustrated or slightly embarrassed by his mother. When she became more unhinged, he eventually had her committed to an asylum, to a sanitarium for a while. She was eventually released, but she lived kind of a very sad rest of her life. To the end of her life, she always left a space next door on the bed for Mr. Lincoln. She was really in some ways broken by the Civil War and its toll. And I think that her historical reputation has been hopelessly muddled by the fact that William Herndon set out on a campaign to ruin her reputation historically in the summer after Lincoln's death and thereafter. But I think that if we really want to understand Mary Todd Lincoln, it's not as the Hellcat, it's not as the difficult woman, which she was, is to understand her loss and to think about the toll it took on Mary Todd Lincoln, and therefore the toll it must have taken on many women, because in that war, everyone knew someone who died. Most families had suffered either a direct or indirect death. She is in some ways a tragic symbol of the emotional toll of the war. Perhaps, I think in the end, William Herndon and Nicolay and Hay are the truly vicious ones, because I think their cruelty has tarnished her reputation for the last 150 years. So commitment, patriotism, service, and sacrifice, those characterize the real reason why women during the Civil War and Northern women matter. And I have only scratched the surface. The war touched every woman's life. Some found new opportunities, some faced personal tragedy, some found salvation and I hope a measure of peace in helping others. Some never really fully recovered from their loss. I've tried to use Emily Quiner Cordelia Harvey, Mary Todd Lincoln, as examples of how complex this story is. It is at our own peril that we forget the stories of the Civil War as contained in the lives of this half of the population. For history only reveals its full significance for all of us today if it includes everyone in our past. Thank you. Ben, you're muted. There you go. Ben, I can't hear you. I don't know if others can.
Sorry, there's another mute button that I didn't hit. Thank you. Technology, even after, how long we've been doing this.
Exactly.
But yeah, thanks, Brett. That was a great presentation, as always. I'll remind everybody, if you have any lingering questions or things you'd like to know more about, this is your opportunity. I guess I can start off with one I was curious about. Obviously this is a story of which, these women have contributed, we might not talk about it as much as you said, but very important. Were they, I guess I'm kind of thinking about, the parallels to, say, World War I, in which, obviously it's a very different context, but, at the end of the war, there are American generals that are and politicians who are saying, thanks women, you made it possible for us to win. Was there a similar sense of recognition for the women in the Civil War? And if not, like, how long did it take before that story kind of emerges? Or do we know that?
I don't think it ever emerged like it did in the World Wars. I don't think there is really an adequate cognate to Rosie the Riveter or whatever the World War I version of, like, how you sum up women's contribution to the war effort from the World War II, or I don't know what the World War I equivalent of that would be. I don't think it's ever been fully recognized. And I don't think that is purposeful as much as it is. If I could go back to what I said earlier in the presentation, the stories of the war, the stories of the military events and the political events are so compelling that you could spend a lifetime learning all those stories, and they're worth knowing, and they're definitely but they are what we've focused on. And I think that they are on the surface, they're more immediately compelling, and therefore they're the ones that people know. But I think that Mother Bickerdyke's story is as amazing as many of the stories that we know from the military aspect of war. I would put Cordelia Harvey up there in that pantheon of Wisconsinites we ought to know from the Civil War. In that same group, I'd put the Iron Brigade and Old Abe the War Eagle. Or other stories of 15th Wisconsin, other stories I could tell you about. I think they're all important, and I think we should know those stories on the home front as well. In the literature, people have been paying a lot more attention to it for the last few decades. I don't know if that's fully percolated down into the larger consciousness, though. What I will say is I think a lot of ordinary Americans knew it. I think they saw it on often a family and community level. I don't know if there was the same national reckoning, but there was, I think, a lot of soldiers knew the way that those letters from home made a difference, and those packages from home and those nurses in the hospitals. They understood, and they knew the way their wives had kept the farm running. I don't know if there's ever quite the same sort of national recognition, though. Sam.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Although it is kind of surprising, considering all of the literature that has been written about the Civil War over the years. You'd think it might get more, but I guess that's the challenge that sometimes we deal with.
Yeah.
Well, I guess one question that was posited when you're talking about was it Emily Queener? June asked, is that a relationship to Caroline Quinner, the mother of Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Not directly. I've been asked that before.
Okay.
And I've been told not directly, although that's not the most common name. So yeah. I've always had a suspicion that if somebody did a little genealogy, they would put those two together pretty quickly, because as I think Joan mentioned, that does raise a flag, and it's something I've wondered about. I don't think directly, though. Emily and Edwin was a very well-known person who stayed in Madison. Emily moved to Colorado later in her life, was a teacher for most of her life, and I don't know of any direct connection though. That is an interesting question. I wish I had a better answer for that one, honestly, because I suspect there is a connection, but I don't know it.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, it looks like that is the, last call here for questions here. I think that maybe be the extent of the ones that are there. I'll just take a moment here, again, to remind you of, again, appreciate you coming in to watch. The next one will be coming up next month, looking at the results locally here in Marathon County and the response to the 1918 influenza pandemic. So if you're interested in that, it's very timely. We'll say that. So yeah. And also, put in a plug here for our weekly events. We do regular history chats where myself and our librarian, Gary Gisselman, usually go back and forth and we talk about a topic. This month, we're finishing up the theme of putting WASA on the map, the various companies and products that have WASA that kind of got the name out there. And we're ending with a good one, which is WASA Insurance. Probably the best example of all of this. So again, if that sounds interesting, these are a little bit shorter. These are midday breaks, only about 15, 20 minutes. And so if you're interested in that, we do those at 12:30 on Thursday. And they, like everything else that we do, is also available, on our YouTube. We put the archived videos for you to watch later. So if you're interested in history, not only is there great stuff coming up, there's also a pretty good backlog of stuff. But yeah, I'll get one more check here just in case. But yeah, it looks like that is the extent of the questions, which is wonderful. So again, thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. And thanks once again to Brett for coming and help doing this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.